Chapter 18, Real Estate Appraisal. An appraisal is a necessary part of most real estate transactions. The decision to buy, sell, or grant a loan on real estate hinges on the property's value. Appraisals are also used to set prices on property listed for sale, used to set premiums on fire insurance policies. It's used by government to acquire and manage public property, and it's used to establish property tax levels. Therefore, an appraisal is simply an estimate of value. In real estate, we have three approaches that we use to estimate value. The first is the market approach, also known as the sales comparison approach, which hinges on using comparable sales to our subject property. The cost approach is equal to the following equation. We take the construction cost new of the improvement, we subtract out accrued depreciation, and then add in the land value. And the income approach is a method of valuing a property based on the monetary returns it can be expected to produce. Regardless of whether we have a high value or a low value property, regardless of whether the assignment is complex or relatively simple, the appraisal process must be followed, and that process is guided by what's known as the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP. We'll talk about USPAP in a later slide. So if an appraisal is an estimate of value, there are many different meanings of the word value: market value, assessed value, estate tax value, insurance value, loan value, plottage value, investment value, replacement value, and salvage value. But by far, frequently requested value to be estimated in an appraisal is market value. So the following is a definition of market value, and this is the same definition you will see in most appraisal textbooks. Market value is the most probable price that a property should bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale, with the buyer and seller each acting prudently and knowledgeably, and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimuli. It's also known as fair market value. Plain and simple, market value is what a willing buyer will pay and what a willing seller will accept. There are four characteristics of value. For something to have value, there must be a demand for it, a need or desire along with the purchasing power to fill it. That item, good, or service should also have utility, the ability of a good or service to fill that need. It should also be scarce, a short supply relative to demand, and it should be transferable. In other words, it can be passed from one person to another. Value has several principles, and these also help guide the appraisal process. The first is the principle of anticipation. That means that value is equal to the present value of that item, that asset's expected future benefits. The principle of substitution says that a property's maximum value is equal to the cost of acquiring an equally desirable substitute. The highest and best use of a property is that use that brings the highest economic value to the owner. The principle of competition means that profits encourage competition. The principle of supply and demand means that value will rise as demand increases and or supply decreases. The principle of change means that no physical or economic condition ever remains constant. The principle of conformity means that the maximum value of a property will be reached when there is homogeneity in an area. And finally, the principle of diminishing marginal returns, also called the principle of contribution, means that there is a relation between the added cost of an item and the value it returns. In other words, the value of a component is how much it contributes to overall. So let's move on to our 3 approaches to determining value. First, the sales comparison, or the market data approach. This is based on the principle of substitution. In the sales comparison approach, there are 6 elements of comparison. Elements of comparison are those characteristics that cause property prices to differ. The 6 elements of comparison are property rights, financing, conditions of sale, market conditions, location, and physical characteristics. We find comparable properties to our subject property, and then we have to make adjustments, positive or negative, to the selling price of those comparable properties. We are trying to make those comparables as similar as possible to our subject. The sales comparison approach can be used for any type of property, but it is most often used for residential owner-occupied properties. But it can be used for any type of property as long as there are true comparables to the subject. And here's an example of that. That's reproduced from your textbook. What's the difference between an appraisal and what's called a competitive market analysis? Oftentimes, you may hear of perhaps brokers or salespeople offering a free competitive market analysis. A competitive market analysis is simply a listing of recently sold property that's somewhat similar to the subject. It is not an appraisal. What it looks like. Our next approach to value is the cost approach to value. Even with properties that are well suited to the market approach, there may be times when it's valuable to apply another valuation approach. Actually, you should try to apply as many as possible, as many out of the 3 as possible. So with the cost approach to value, you have an estimate of the land as vacant. You're also going to estimate the construction costs of the building, new. You're going to subtract out any accrued depreciation. And instead of estimated depreciation, the slide should say accrued depreciation. We're going to subtract out the accrued depreciation from the construction cost new. That's the depreciated value of the building. And then you add in the land as vacant, and you've got an estimate of the property value by the cost approach. This approach is really good for properties that are odd, that are where you can't find any comparables. perhaps like a church, a fire station, things which are very hard to find similar properties. You can always lean on the cost approach to estimate your value. When it comes to estimating the cost of the improvement new, there are two different options. You can either estimate the reproduction cost of the improvement or the replacement cost. The reproduction cost is the cost of an exact replica of your subject, whereas replacement cost is the cost of an improvement that has the same utility as the subject property. Reproduction cost is often used for newer improvements, whereas replacement costs may be used for older improvements. And then we have to subtract out this idea of depreciation, accrued depreciation. This is not tax depreciation. In the context of the cost approach to value, depreciation means loss in value, a loss in value. And there are three different types of accrued depreciation. There's physical deterioration. This is wear and tear. Functional obsolescence. That may be a property that has outdated equipment, faulty or an outdated design. And economic obsolescence. This is a loss in value due to external forces or events. And when we talk about accrued depreciation, there is a saying that fits in here, that more houses are torn down than fall down. Our third approach to value is the income approach. The income approach considers the monetary returns a property can be expected to produce and converts that value the property should sell for if placed on the market today. And when we use something called direct capitalization, we take the property's income, divide by a capitalization rate, and that will give us value. And to capitalize and means to convert an income. Well, how do you find the income necessary to capitalize? Well, there's different types of income. First, we start with scheduled or projected gross income. That's the estimated rent a fully occupied property can be expected to produce on an annual basis. Operating expenditures are the expenditures necessary to maintain the production of income. Part of operating expenses may include something called reserves for replacement. This is established for items that do not require an expenditure of cash each year. And finally, we get to something called net operating income. And this is what an operating statement might look like for a property. Well, the final step is direct capitalization, where we take that net operating income and we divide it by an overall capitalization rate to find value. In this class, we won't go over how to find that overall capitalization rate, but we do study that in Finance 441, Real Estate Appraisal, of the approaches to value as possible. You use what's called reconciliation. That's deriving one number from several. And in this case, with this example, you see that all three approaches were applied, resulting in three different values. The appraiser then uses his or her experience and knowledge of the market to apply weights to the different approaches. In this case, I see that the appraiser had a great deal of confidence in the data and his application of the market approach, and hence assigned a 75% weight to the market approach. And he had very little confidence in the income approach for this value. So hence reconciliation is deriving one value from a series of value or estimates of value, and it's using a weighted approach. And in this case, we come up with a final indicated value. A federal law called FIRREA drastically changed the appraisal industry. FIRREA was passed in 1989, and FIRREA stands for Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act. FIRREA created mandatory requirements for certain federally related real estate appraisals. And these requirements became known as US PAP, or the Uniform Standards of Professional Practice. And following the guidelines of US PAP, the appraisal process is a step-by-step procedure that all appraisers must use, again, regardless of whether or not it is a high value or a low value property, regardless of whether it is a very complex assignment or a simple one. The steps still need to be followed. First, define the problem. 2, conduct a preliminary analysis, formulate a plan, collect the necessary data. Step 3, estimate the highest and best use of the property, as if it were vacant, as well as if the property were improved. So we estimate the land value separately. We estimate the improved property value through the appropriate value approaches. We reconcile the results. And finally, we report the conclusion. When it comes to reporting, there are 2 types of appraisals. One is a complete and the other is a limited appraisal. And there are 3 levels of reporting: a self-contained report, a summary report, and a restrictive report. In terms of the formats, it can take the form of a letter report, a form report, or a narrative report. Your book talks a little bit about review appraisals as well as analysis. A review appraisal is when another appraiser reviews your work, can come up behind you, use the same data, the same process, and arrive at the same value. An analysis does not report value. And analysts must observe the following guidelines: clearly identify the client's objective, define the problem, collect, verify, reconcile data, apply the appropriate tools, techniques, base all projections of the analysis on clear and appropriate evidence. But again, an analysis does not report value. Only an appraisal will do such, will offer an estimate of value. When it comes to the real estate markets, a buyer's market is when there's an excess supply of real estate for sale and prices are low. A seller's market is when demand exceeds supply and prices are high. A broad market is when many buyers and sellers are in the market at the same time, and a thin market would be when there are only a few buyers and sellers at the same time. There are appraiser professional organizations, and here's a list of different organizations that appraisers can join, but by far the most respected of all of these is the Appraisal Institute. And here are our terms for Chapter 18.